icebreaker and having a few people talk to us about an example, a participant in your program who has been helpful to other people, whether that was to their peers, other clients, whether it was to you or other staff people at your agency, or helpful in some way to family and friends. And I think is Letitia from BH Care with us? I think she was going to try and kick us off if she's here. Letitia, are you with us?
Maybe just remind people that how you can unmute yourself.
Thanks, Shannon. So I'm also looking to see if we can see Letitia. I'm going to unmute you, Letitia. It looks like you're muted.
Thank you. Yes, no, I pressed the button and it wasn't working at all. Yeah, no, I often find that a lot of my folks are extremely helpful and generous, not only with their peers, but they have the temperature of the street better than I do most of the time. So they know when someone's new or when someone's in need and maybe not saying something. They're excellent with helping their peers move in once they're housed. Unfortunately, that usually ends up with them couch surfing a bit. But yeah, no, they're always very helpful. Even if it's just with complete strangers, they get to know the usual people in the community and they help them. But my folks also help others, whether it's loading their cars with groceries or knowing when something's wrong. They tend to have a better temperature of the street than I do most of the time.
Great. And so Angela will talk a lot more about that, I think, when we get into service planning and motivation building today. But like, how do we use those strengths and those skills to build people's confidence, right? And also, to make sure that the things that we're working on, right, that we're leveraging those skills and those strengths that people really have. Do we have Phil? Thank you, Letitia. Do we have Phil from Reliance Health? I think Phil was also gonna share a little bit. Let's see if we can find Phil on the list. Maybe he's having the same trouble. Theoretically, people should be able to unmute themselves, but I know the technology doesn't always work as expected. So I am not. Shannon, can you help me? Do you see?
I'm looking. I'm not seeing him. Phil, if you're by phone, if you could put the last 4 digits of your phone in the chat box, we could unmute you if you're not able to. What was it, *6 you're supposed to be able to?
Yeah, if you're on the phone, you could try *6, Phil, to unmute yourself. All right, maybe he wasn't able to join, or is having difficulty with the technology. Yeah. But is there anyone else that wants to share a little bit about an example of a client that you've worked with that has been helpful to you, to clients? Don't all speak at once. Phil just texted me and said he's running late. Thank you, Lisa. Okay. So I'm going to move us on. Also, I just wanted to say, for people that can't see the chat box or not sure how to do that, Brenda Earl from Demas says, good morning to everyone. And just a reminder that if you're a PATH provider, to please email her to let her know that you are in attendance today. So, okay. Right, so we're going to move on and talk a little bit about needs assessment. So, I don't know about you guys, but I know when I was doing case management, I did not have a single client ever come to me and say, gee, what I'm really dying to do is to fill out that needs assessment form, right? People hate filling out forms. And if you come to them with a long needs assessment form and you say, oh my God, we have to do this form, it's a requirement, right? Like, you don't want to do it, they don't want to do it, right? So there's an alternative. So we're talking about like an alternative way to do needs assessment, because you guys are every day, right, talking to your clients, doing things with them, watching them do things, and so throughout the course of all of that work together, you're learning tons of stuff about them, right? You're learning about what's most important to them. You're learning about what their strengths are. You're learning about what their barriers to housing are. You're learning about, by watching them and also by the things that they're telling you, what services they're connected to, what services they need, who they turn to for support, even informally beyond service providers, other people, friends, family, pastors, whatever. You're learning all of this information about your folks, and that you're doing that constantly throughout the course of your work, right? So we encourage everybody to think about needs assessment, right, as a process, not an event. So it's not one time every 6 months that you sit down with your client and you say, hey, let's fill out this form because someone told me I have to, right? It's the conversations that you're having day in and day out with people. And so, if one of the things I think that we often see all workers, but I think particularly outreach workers do, because filling out a long form on the street, right, is often not practical. And so, one of the things I think you guys are often doing probably is, just going about your regular course of business with the client and then taking notes, right? Like whether it's on a little pad that you have, or a lot of people do it on their phones, either, text, manually or voice recording, right? And then leaving like the filling out the form part until you get back to the office. And that I think can be a more successful maybe way of trying to do needs assessment, particularly in an outreach program. So for the PATH programs, right, on this slide is, and all of these little, when you see these little like Microsoft Word icons on the slides, those documents are embedded. And so if you click on that and the slides that Shannon sent out, you should be able to open that document. In case you have trouble with it, Shannon has also sent these out and posted them to the chat separately. But we really are trying with the PATH project in partnership with Demas, of course, to have the paperwork requirements be as minimal as possible for outreach. And so we've created this assessment and service planning template. And the assessment part of it is really short. It's like half a page, right? And so it really just does, what are the strengths? What are the person's housing barriers? What are the issues that are impacting their safety or their well-being? Where was the last permanent place that they stayed? What factors led to their homelessness? Who do they turn to for support and an emergency contact? And that's it, right? It's super short. And so this template, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about monitoring requirements, is required for use for the PATH programs, and it's been required since March. So if you've not already started to use it, please do that. So this next slide really looks at more, because it's brief. That assessment form template is very brief, and I think many of you may work at an agency where your agency has another assessment form that they want you to do. And when you can, that really is, we think, a best practice, right? Because there's a lot more information than just what's on that brief assessment form that you're gonna need to know to help people get housed, right? And that's the point of assessment, right? The point of assessment isn't filling out a form every 6 months, right? It's getting the information that you need in order for you and the client to decide what you're gonna work on together, and what this person needs to be connected to in order to get housing. Right? So I won't go through all of these, but these are many of the fields that are often on a more deeper dive assessment form. So, and this kind of assessment, again, for PATH programs is not required, but is definitely, we think, a best practice. So one of the areas that I'm going to talk a little bit more about is that you're definitely going to need to know more about than what you're going to put on that PATH brief assessment is the person's housing and homeless history, right? So like, where have they lived? Maybe a lot of times places are doing for the past 5 years, like a housing history for the past 5 years. Who did they live with, right? So that's really important because people that somebody lived with in the past might be a resource again in the future for a potential housing option or not, depending on how well that went. Whether or not the person has been a leaseholder in the past, what worked for them where they lived before, what they liked, what they didn't like, what didn't work, right? How long have they been homeless? Where did they stay while they were homeless? And also, how did they spend their day, right? While they're homeless, how do they spend their day, right? Who do they hang out with and what do they do? Because if you so let's say you have somebody that the way that they spend their day is they are feeding and caring for the 35 cats that they've adopted, right? Or they spend their day collecting small appliances that they then pile up in their tents, right? That they're gonna fix, right? Those things are gonna be issues, both in terms of housing access and housing retention. So you wanna make sure that you get a complete picture around that and that you understand that. So on this slide, again, we went into a lot of detail on this last time, so I'm not gonna do that today. But for folks that weren't able to join us last time, or just as a reminder for those that were able to join us, is the housing preference discussion framework, right? So that's really a tool that can help you have these conversations with your clients where they're telling you what's most important to them about their housing, like what kind of neighborhood do they live in, who do they want to live near, all of the different elements of a housing unit, what they care about most, right? So that you can help them to look at, okay, here's where you live currently. Here are the 5 things that you said are most important to you. Where you live currently under the bridge has none of these things, right? Here are 2 units that we're able to locate. Let's see how taking one of these units might get you closer to getting the things you told me you want, right? So it's really a tool to help the client to evaluate where they live currently versus other options that they might have. So it's a non-judgmental way of helping people to assess their options and to make a decision that really honors what they feel is most important to them. All right, and then of course, obviously, you're going to need to know something about their money situation if you want to try to help them get housed, right? So you're going to need to certainly understand what upfront cash they're going to need for housing, right? So deposit, utility deposit. Maybe they probably don't have much, so they're going to need to buy some stuff for their place or get some stuff for their place. And then, of course, the ongoing, how much cash are they going to need ongoing? And one of the things you definitely want to make sure you consider is any debts that they have, right? So do they have, or obligations that they have, so child support is a big one that comes up. And then also informal debts, right? So do they owe money to a drug dealer? Do they owe money to a loan shark, right? So you're definitely going to want to get more of a deeper picture than what you're going to put on that brief assessment in terms of their financial needs and obligations. And so, we always think it's as much as you can write down, the better. It's better if you can I don't know if you're anything like me, it's very hard for me to remember all this detail. So it helps you to remember, but it also helps to make sure if you're no longer around and able to serve that person, that the next person that comes in knows something about the client and what you're working on together. I know documentation is not your guys' favorite thing to do, but it is, the more you can write down, the better. Okay. So we want to talk about, I think sometimes when we talk about finances with clients, right, in social services, we have a tendency to approach this conversation by saying, let's do a budget, right? And I don't know about you, but I never had a single client in all the years that I did direct service ever come to me and say, oh, Lauren, I am dying to do a budget. Please, 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 can you tell me how I should spend my money, right? No one says that. No one says that. People hate doing a budget. And the reason they hate doing a budget is because they have a tiny little bit of money, right? And they don't want you to tell them not to spend it on cigarettes, right? They don't want you to tell them how to spend their little bit of money. And so, for me, anytime I ever said to a client, hey, let's do a budget, they were like this guy on this slide, like running as fast as they could away from me. So another way that you might want to approach the conversation about people's finances is, instead of saying, let's do a budget, is to say to them, tell me about how much money you're going to need to live comfortably in housing, right? Let's look at what the expenses are going to be together. And you tell me, like, how much money do you need, to not just pay your rent and your utilities, but all the other things that you need and want to live your life in a way that is feels good to you, right? And then, like, let's talk together. Okay, so this is how much we think you need. This is how much you got. Like, let's talk together about how I can help you get closer to what, you said, you told me you need. Tends, in our experience, to go much better than the let's do a budget conversation. So, okay, I'm going to turn it over to Andrea, and she's going to talk about service planning.
Great. Thanks, Lauren. Let's go to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about why we do service planning. Service planning provides people with a template to move forward. And why is that important? Because it's predictable. And it also establishes roles of the worker and gives people things that you can work on together. It should also be focused on what really matters to the clients. So the assessment that we talked about and figuring out what means the most to them, and the goal setting is something we're going to talk about. The other thing is that a good plan should provide people with small steps. 6 months is a long time to have a plan for. You can actually make some of the objectives and some of the things that you want to accomplish together much smaller, and the time frame to be much shorter. What will that do? That will give people the sense of progress. It's a process that's fraught with delays, right? Well, I thought they were going to call me. Did they accept me or not? Well, we haven't really heard from them, or we're looking for housing. People say to me all the time, I'm never going to get housing, aren't I? This has been 2 months. And I think, yeah, I understand what you're saying, but let's talk about the progress you made. And this plan is a good way to do that. The other thing about a plan is it includes ongoing assessment, and it has to be guided by the discussions you have with a client, because you never get it all in the beginning of an assessment. Never, right? Assessments bloom over time as people begin to trust you more. So the other thing that a good plan can do, and revisiting the plan, is to help people get a sense of accomplishment. As people get a sense of accomplishment, they're more motivated to continue because they see what they're doing well. So it's all part of a sort of strength-based approach. Okay, let's go to the next one. So what do we want to do when we're building a plan with people? We want to focus it on the things that are most important, and we want to really limit the areas of intervention. So the question I always ask people is, if you've ever made a New Year's resolution, everybody's got that friend that makes 10 New Year's resolutions. These are the 10 things I'm going to do. Well, unless they divide them up into biteable chunks, they probably don't accomplish 10 things. Who gets things and make a really concrete plan to do it? The other thing we've got to do is connect the interventions to their long-term goals. Okay. So one of their long-term goals is to get SSI, let's say, right? It's long-term because the process is long. What can they do in the meantime? So, we've been talking about you going to see a doctor. How will that help them get money, right? We've been talking about how much you want to date. How will housing help with that? You always want to talk about what the long-term goals are and what they're getting out of it. And we're going to talk about that in terms of a So That principle. The other thing is things don't go in a straight line. We all know that. How do you learn more? I learn more when I make mistakes. So we have to be prepared for steps backwards and steps forward, right? though it's sometimes frustrating. The other thing is that we want to teach people how to consider things and how to problem solve. And problem solving usually includes more than one option. And teaching that problem solving skills help people move away from more crisis-driven lives. And we all know what crisis does, right? Most people have been in crisis all their life, so they become very reactive, and being reactive means, okay, I'll just do this. Just the first thing that occurs to them. Helping them problem solve moves them away from that. And if people are crisis-driven, it's going to take, sometimes it can take up your whole week, and certainly really derail them from the planned progress. Okay, let's go to the next one. So what do? We begin the plan with basic needs, how to meet their basic needs, right? And what are things that people need? Pain relief. So somebody's got a hurty foot and they're floridly psychotic. Our first intervention would probably be to focus on the psychosis, but what's their first? What are they focused on? They're focused on that foot. And if they can get some relief to that foot, then they might develop more trust in the medical system. They might have more trust in other things. So we want to take the things that are their priorities. And oftentimes they're getting where they need to be. It's often a big goal. We want to think about what their big goals are, and we want to help them meet those. It also provides us with an opportunity to divide up the tasks in the way that defines our roles. And one of the things that we find in housing is people have no idea how to use the case managers. So what you're doing is you're teaching people or mentoring them to use case management, and that's really important. The other thing in the process of these goals, I don't know if anybody's ever, probably you're not going to Social Security now or waiting with somebody waited with people in a clinic waiting room. It was a great time to just let them talk. And we learn an amazing amount in that thing. Driving has always been one of my best. I used to call it California therapy. People were looking out the window and they start to tell you stories, and those stories are what's really going to make that assessment rich. It also sets the tone that we listen to people, that we reward people by paying attention to their strengths, that we help people problem solve, and struggles are meant to be something that we work on together. Okay, let's go to the next one. We also want to use some stages of change. So we're not going to read you this whole chart, but it's been helpful and we went through it the last time. So just remember that we can start to work with people before they see a need to change that behavior. What we can do is heighten their awareness of how that behavior both interferes and helps them. Helps them so we can find a replacement, increases their struggles is something we want to talk to them about. So we want to ask them open-ended questions. We want to also use the pros and cons sheet because that teaches critical thinking, right? Because we're always conscious of moving away from crisis. And then we want to help people get more and more options. And then we want to work with people as they step back. And as people achieve goals, we want to get new goals because goals bring people structure and purpose. And structure and purpose is something that's going to help them both move forward, maintain motivation, but also we know it helps people maintain housing because if people have something to do, they're less likely to get in trouble. I mean, that's pretty simple, right? It's sort of like my grandmother used to say, come here, help me do some cooking or help me do this. The devil's work, idle hands are the devil's work. Yeah, well, that was probably true for me. And it's pretty much true for everybody. If they don't have enough to do, people will figure out things to do. So help people figure out things that actually move them forward in life. Okay, let's go to the next one. We're also always going to work on the progress to more complicated goals. And ideally, as we said, the short-term goals really affect the long-term goals. And housing in this case is more of a long-term goal, becomes the goal that we focus on. We help people understand how the small things that they've accomplished help them move forward. We also help them to understand that the small things that they've accomplished in their work with us helps define what they want. We also notice the things that people do naturally, and we connect that to people's values, right? So Letitia talked about how generous a lot of the folks she works with are, how they help other people. You know, that's a role, to help other people. And we want to keep that up. That's very useful to people. We also want to help people frame it as a helper role so they can transform that role. So if they're very streetwise, they're living in an encampment, they're always paying attention to other people in the encampment, we notice how you like to help people. We've really appreciated you steering us towards people who need new help or new people. How do you think that would work out in housing? How can we focus that role in housing? So we also want to talk about people's dreams and aspirations. So let's talk about that a little bit. Let's go to the next slide. So one of the things we often ask people is about goals. We want to talk to people about, we may not want to use the word goals. Maybe we want to talk to people about what they want, what means something to them. What do they imagine their life to be looking for? We want to identify people's values and what's important. And we do that through observation and seeing what they do on a continuing basis, like the generosity. And we want to do that through talking through how they can move towards for their goals. Let people dream a little bit. I often hear frustration from case managers, usually housing case managers, when people say to them, I didn't really want to be here. I wanted a house with a yard. And the case manager says, so I confronted him on his unrealistic expectation. Look, everybody, you know, if you were homeless in the street and didn't think you had any hope of moving forward, what would you dream about? Would you dream about a little efficiency apartment, or would you dream about a house with a yard and a couple of dogs and maybe a couple of kids, right? That's what people dream about. And then we're going to set that as long-term goals. And it's fine if somebody has a 700-year goal, because working towards that goal is going to give them a focus to move forward on other things. And we can connect things like living in that efficiency apartment and getting a landlord reference. And let's talk about what that means. That will help you connect to different types of housing, and you'll probably have more to choose from if you have a landlord reference. We want to identify things that are negotiable and non-negotiable to people. And a lot of times they're concrete. Some people say, I can't live in that neighborhood because I owe the drug dealers money in that neighborhood. Whoops, that's a damn good reason not to live in that neighborhood, right? Because unless you want the drug dealers taking over that apartment, you can probably see how that would be, you know, difficult. What if people say, I heard a story in Connecticut one time that the guy said he only wanted to live in this one area, and they figured out that it was on one bus line. And they asked him, what's important? He said, I know how to get around and stuff. Does it have to do with a bus line? Yes. What if we teach you another bus line? Do you think that would help? Why don't we go on the bus line together and try to look at another area? At first he said no, but he was willing to go on the bus. Then he said, well, maybe I see some places I think I could be comfortable here. So sometimes it's something very concrete. Sometimes it's very, you know, what's non-negotiable? You know, I worked with a family once who really wanted a house in Manhattan. And, you know, the chances of them getting a house were pretty small. That wasn't a 700-year goal. That was a 7,000-year goal. So I was talking about this, and I finally asked him, why does that mean so much to you to have a house? And she said to me, because only people. Okay. Another person said to me, you know what? If I had a house, my kids wouldn't look poor. Okay, so those become the goals. Not looking poor, having your own bathroom. We can narrow those down as we're going through it. We can always see the next step as the step towards the goal. And it is possible that people eventually get a house, but it's going to take things like increasing their income and a landlord reference. Okay, let's go to the next one. So how we do that too is we do the decisional balance sheet, and you guys have seen that. So what are the advantages of staying where I am? Oftentimes, you know, especially if it was around drinking or something, I really want to stop drinking. And I think, great. And this teaches us that we ask people what they like about it. So we're asking people what they like about being homeless and letting them talk. Why? Because we've got to know how to transition those things that they really want and put it in a new context of housing. So unless we know the good things, we're not going to ever move forward. So we need the positives and negatives. And then we need to know what they imagine is going to happen in the next step. I had somebody tell me once, I'm not going to this place. I'm not going to this place. And I realized we were calling it permanent supportive housing when we described it. And he said, I don't want to live in a place and be stuck there forever. So it's permanent. And I thought, oh, okay. So let's talk about what are the realities of permanent supportive housing. It's permanent as long as you want it to be. It doesn't have to be permanent long-term. So we're going to explain those things to people, and we'll get that in terms of the pros and cons. Okay, let's go to the next one. So what if somebody has no goals? Look, think about how many times they've been asked, what are your goals, right? It's probably going to be 700, and they feel like nothing ever happened. So goals may be, in fact, a trigger for them. Homelessness, because there's a hopelessness about homelessness, limits the ability to think about other options. Also, homelessness is a crisis, so people think in crisis terms. So they don't think about, oh, I have these options, let's do the positives and negatives of them. They think, oh, I have this option, I'm going to go for it. So if people are focused on survival, people feel like a loss of control. I can't tell you how many times running permanent supportive housing, I say to people, so why did you decide on this building? And they say to me, because my case manager made me. Did their case manager really make them? No, but you know what? They feel like they didn't have a choice. So you want to make sure that people have choices, even if they're few and far between. And you want to make sure that people can think critically about them, which is the point of the sheet that Lauren gave you. The other thing is we want to focus on the good things in their housing history. What worked for them in housing, and even if they hated the place or they got kicked out, which is probably a traumatic experience, there was something they liked about it. And we also want to focus on the positives of their role. You know, I noticed that you're, helping people with their groceries and doing things and helping the store owner sweep up. Have you ever thought maybe you can do some of those things for a landlord, and maybe we can negotiate some of that stuff? We also need to realize that sometimes psychiatric symptoms and substance abuse can affect people's willingness and ability to think things through. So we may have to divide it up in small parts. We may have to come back when people are more put together. So those are things we have to understand. Okay, let's go to the next one. We also want to talk about the discrepancy without confronting people, because we know from motivational interviewing, and we talked about it last session, that if we confront people directly, they're more likely to get protective and they're more likely to be, push back. And sometimes it makes them more set in their ways. So we need to do this gently, but we need to think about it. So you've been talking about having a place is the most important thing to you, but it sounds like the place that you want most requires a disability form. So it's been a problem for you to get to the doctors. Is there a problem getting to the doctors? Is there something you're worried about to get the form filled out? Or is this really not the option that you're most interested in? Let's talk about how you want to move forward, because our goal is to help people move forward, and let's give them other choices. Does everybody have to go into PSH? No, it might be the best option for them, but everything doesn't require a disability form. And if that's a significant barrier, let's think about how to get around it. But let's also talk about what are the benefits for getting the form and how it widens people's choices. So we're going to have a conversation with people where they're looking at positives and negatives, but we're also going to be aware that sometimes people might be reluctant to tell us why. A lot of the people that I worked with psychiatric symptoms would not go see a doctor again because they thought the doctor would swoop them up and put them in the hospital. Well, that's a very significant fear. And that would make housing about that stuff before we get to the point where we're moving forward. Okay, let's go to the next one. Basically, what we're talking about here is the basic tenets of motivational interviewing. And this always felt to me like the core of motivational interviewing. First of all, people have to have hope, and that's really reinforcing people's strengths. If people don't feel like something is possible, they're less likely to move towards it. It has to be meaning. It has to have meaning. It has to be important to people. It has to reflect something, even though the task at hand may not be something that the person is interested, they have to see the connection to something that means something to them. Think about yourself, right? Okay, so anybody here ever been in a relationship where there were a few little things you want to change about the other person and you figured, okay, we'll get together and I'll wipe those out? How'd that work for you? No. People change because it's meaning to them. And you putting pressure on them, I'm sure in these relationships, no matter how much they love you, it's going to be hard for them till they see how it has meaning for them. The other thing is confidence. And we want to give people examples of how they survived when they were homeless, how they learned how to follow rules. I can't follow rules in housing. Well, there are a lot of rules when you're homeless, right? Can we talk about some of those rules and how you figured them out? Sounds to me like you're pretty good at figuring out what works and what doesn't work. Let's talk about that, right? So we want to point out places where people were successful before so they have the confidence to move forward. Okay, let's go to the next one. So we start with immediate needs, we build it up. We ask questions like, not so much, do you have any goals, but what would make you comfortable right now? Is there anything that would make a difference there? Well, yeah, if my tent didn't have a hole in it, or if I had a sleeping bag, okay, let's talk about how to get that. And make it a little bit of a process. I mean, don't withhold it from people, but make it a little bit of a process. So let's figure out how to get that together so that they see you as more of an expediter than the one who provides everything, because people have to work through systems to get things. What would help to make your life better next week, next month? What would it look like? What do you imagine, or what would you like your life to look like 6 months from now? Remember, sometimes people in the midst of this homeless crisis can't think 6 months from now, but it's a good question for people who can. And you might hear things that surprise you. Well, I figure I'll have a job, I'll have other things. Let's work towards that. How much money do you need to live comfortably, which is something that Lauren talked about. And remember, people had lives before homelessness, and oftentimes they involve big loss. People are also insulted that at this age and time that they're living the way they are. So a lot of times people feel bad about that. And that the saddest thing I ever saw is people, one guy moved into a 1-bedroom apartment, and he looked around and there was basic furniture and that was it. And he said to me, I never thought I'd be here when I'm 50 years old. Stay with that a little bit. Talk about what people can move towards, because it's a really hard thing. Okay, let's go to the next one. We also want to be aware of compliance goals. You all know what those are, right? So for me, I was always very focused on mental illness, and people would say it. I'd say, well, what do you want out of life? And they'd say to me, Oh, I'd like to take my medication as planned and, not be psychotic. Huh, really? Okay, if you talk to a 12-year-old and you said, what do you want to be when you grow up? And they said they'd like to take regular medication, would you worry about them? Think about that. Goals are, and things that people want are not things like take my meds as prescribed. That might be a process to get something they want, but that's not the ultimate goal. I want to keep all my appointments. Why? What do you think that would do for you? What's it going to do for you? It's a so that principle. We want to think about that. What do you think it's going to do for you if you take your medication as prescribed? What do you imagine life would be like if you take your medication as prescribed? Be clear, we're not trying to talk people out of it. We're trying to talk people into seeing the future for these things that they've identified that they know we want. I'm going to use less drugs. Huh, okay. So that what's going to happen? Well, when I use less drugs, my family's going to welcome me back. My kids are going to come back. I'm going to have a really nice apartment. It's going to be a 2-bedroom apartment, and I'm going to get a girlfriend. Wow. Okay. So how do we work towards those things? And how do we see using less drugs and maybe having more money as a step towards those goals? Because what happens is oftentimes in supportive housing, at about 3 months, people can't figure out why all the changes things that they wanted, even though they never told their worker that they wanted. And they say things like, well, they used to say it to me, you're the worst case manager. I want a smart case manager. I've been working so hard and I don't even have a date. Okay. So we want to know what are those things that people want. Oh yeah, people say stick to a budget. That's definitely a goal that's meant to make you happy. Okay, let's go to the next one. So the other thing is the requirements in PATH are every 6 months. So I'm going to say an unpopular thing. Outreach usually does them at least on a monthly basis. But if you can update the plan and make some of the goals short enough so you can update the plan, and it should be done in a way that's not too onerous to you, because we're not trying to get you guys to make more paperwork. We're trying to get you to be able to talk to people about a structure to move forward. And the only way to do that is the plan. You also want to document the steps achieved and take a minute to let people describe whatever goal it was. If they got a sleeping bag and the idea was they were going to go someplace to pick it up. Wow, okay, so you went someplace to pick it up and we did this together. We applied for the sleeping bag. How did you do that? We want to build their confidence and feeling of competence that they can move forward. We want to identify any barriers that came up and how they problem solved around those. We want to know adjustments, right? What do they need to adjust in terms of supports? Well, when I really wanted to get housing, it seemed to me that in order to get a disability form, I had to see a doctor. Okay, so let's add the doctor to one of your supports. We want to also reassess their priorities, because priorities change. As people move forward in their goals, priorities change. They also see what case managers can do, so they're going to be asking you for different things. We want to always ask if their preferences are still the same, if their long-term goals are still the same, and we want to refresh those goals. So we have a couple of case studies for you. So we're going to divide you up into groups. We're going to come into the groups. And we're going to ask you about these people, and they're deliberately short. You can feel free to add things to them. Oh, I knew a person like that. What are they looking for? Maybe this is what they're looking for. But in each person's case, we're going to talk about what they're looking for. We're asking in the story that they tell us what would help this person move forward. So we're looking for confidence and competence and strengths. What do you see as the barriers? And what are your options to overcome those barriers? And then you're going to report out on what's the plan, and where do you start, and also where the time frame. What's the time frame? Okay, so Lauren's going to divide us in groups, and we're going to pull up the cases if we can. I'm sort of a Luddite, so I might have to read the case to you, but we'll function. Okay? So it takes a minute to get us in groups. Do people have any questions about the first part? Feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat box, whatever you're most comfortable. Melissa.
Lauren, unmute yourself if you're talking.
Yeah, Andrea, I'm gonna put the us in the groups first so that we're in the group with everyone else.
Okay.
So
Bye, you guys.
for a minute, guys.
About how many minutes are we going to be in the groups about?
15?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, let's try to do 15. I should be leaving you soon.
If you have access to the slides already, you might want to pull these discussion questions up on your slides so you have them in front of you, but we will all have them in front of us to refer to when we're in groups.
Yeah. So how y'all doing? You got big plans for the weekend? Sorry about this.
All right, sorry about that, guys. Took longer than I thought. Okay, I'm opening the rooms now.
Hey, Melissa. You're the only person I can see right now.
Hi.
Hi. All right, some other people are showing up. I'm going to go ahead and try to share our case. Let's see here. All right, can you all see Peter is our case that we're going to work on? I think it might take a few minutes for people to come in. All right, so Peter, I'm going to read Peter's. So I apologize. Months ago, we scheduled for trees to be cut down, and they're being cut down this morning. So if you hear background noise, somebody holler background noise, that's what it is. And feel free to unmute yourself as we go along. If you can't, just like wave at me or notify me somehow, and I'll try to remedy that situation. I'm going to try to pull up. I don't think I can. I'll pull up the chat again, so I'll have access to that if people want to say something, if you want to talk and I'm not able to see you. Okay, so Peter has been living in an encampment off and on for years. He used to have a wife, children, and a house. He was injured on the job and started to take pain pills. That went downhill quickly. His family went, and so did the house. He said he was done with them. They were too much work. Peter now manages the encampment. He maintains order, assigns tasks, makes everyone keep it clean. He helps the guys get benefits and then takes a small cut. He has no benefits himself. He says that he wants housing. He also says he's worried about how his guys would survive He says he wants peace and quiet, but he gives orders and watches everything. He tried a hotel, did okay. He made friends with the hotel staff and was helpful. They confronted him about the people that he moved into his room, and he blew up. After all he did, he couldn't believe that they were just being jerks. So he left the hotel, breaking the front door as he went. So that's Peter. And then we have these discussion questions. Maybe you have somebody that you can relate to Peter. So the first question is, what's Peter looking for? What do you all think he's looking for? Melissa, I know, yeah, there, Rob, you unmuted yourself.
Sure.
Yeah. He would probably say he wants housing, but I'm not entirely sure that's what he wants. Yeah.
He was saying that he wants peace and quiet
Yeah.
here. Is one of the things, right? That's what he was looking for.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm. And I think he wants to be appreciated for what he's doing.
yeah. So if you don't think he wants housing, you think he wants to be appreciated, why are you saying you don't think he wants housing?
Because I think that everything he does at the encampment, like, builds his, like, whatever self-esteem he has is coming from that. And, you know, that's also a source of income right now. So.
Yeah. So income is something he wants to, right?
Yeah. The first thing I would probably try to do with him is get him set up with his own benefits.
You're jumping ahead. That's like,
Okay.
that's one of the last questions.
Okay. There's a lot of obstacles. Are we still in strengths or obstacles?
Okay, so he's looking for income, appreciation, benefits. Rob, what did you say?
So he said he wanted peace and quiet, and maybe that's a way to start the framework for getting him housing. His own housing. It sounds like he's tied to a community that he gets some worth out of, and also helping him sustain himself, but also holding him back in some ways.
Yeah, connection to community, seems to be important to him.
I mean, I would use it as an opportunity to talk about solving his own situation first, and looking at housing as a way to get the peace and quiet, and then from there looking at how he could then continue. He doesn't just because he has housing doesn't mean he's not part of the community that's there, but
right,
at least one way to start to segue into that discussion around housing. Right.
I just want to make sure, I can only see the two people right now, but I know some people have joined by phone. So if anyone else wanted to join in, please feel free, make yourself known. Either put in the chat box that you need to be unmuted, or just shout out, unmute yourself by clicking on the telephone icon or *6. All right, the next question. You started to go towards this. What do you hear that might help this person move towards housing? So you did, you identified his desire for peace and quiet, to talk about looking at his situation first. Actually, you talked about connection to community, right? So his situation first, and then he might be in a better situation to help others, and a more stable situation also, right? And income, we know that he wants an income because he is taking a cut from other people's benefits. So how can we facilitate his own income, right? If that is something that means something to him. We also know that he helps, like we can build, he's got some definite strengths here that he talks about, right? Everything clean. He talks about maintaining order. And he's facilitating other people getting benefits. So how can we, first of all, acknowledge those things and help him know that we appreciate those things. Those things are appreciated in the community. And how can those skills and abilities go towards his own well-being, improving his own situation? Excuse me. Anything that I didn't cover, Melissa, Rob, anybody else? Help it. We're wanting to know what we heard that might help this person move towards housing.
One of the participants put in the chat that he's somewhat of a leader.
Yeah. Thank you for seeing that. Yeah, definitely. So acknowledge that as well. To help him see what he has achieved already, right?
And some of these goals will help him, like maybe if he's employable in the future, like, or some of the things that he's doing, you know, he could apply to a job, you know, if we get a point.
And Philip Rose here.
Oh, hi, Phil.
Hey, sorry, my camera's off. But maybe just trying to get him to the under-term goal and what's the long-term as we wait for the income to come. So is a room worse than a tent? You know, because we can get funding for a room for a few months,
right?
Until we wait for your income to come in. To try to get them to rationalize the short-term versus the long, I think might be helpful, and address his pain pills as well.
Yeah, we haven't talked about that. And that was the next question. What do you see as the barriers? So that could be barrier, the pain pills, right? So and talking about with him, maybe like what's good about the pain pills, how they help him, right? But then also if there are unintended consequences from him taking those pills that might detract from his ability to be housed, or might lead to the situations that he doesn't want right now, whatever those, like let him define those situations. What is he not happy about right now? And how does the pain pills play into that?
And that's probably also with more of the housing first model, maybe that's not the thing that's addressed right up front, you know, maybe get them housed first and then it's easier to address the addiction.
Yeah, for sure. Not a precondition for being housed at all, but just maybe seeing the ties between some of his circumstances now and those unintended consequences of the pain pill. Any other barriers?
Maybe his anger could be. Seems like there's some anger issues, mental health. Maybe get him to talk to a therapist about his anger. And he's had a lot of loss so in his life.
So that's the next. Go ahead.
No, that's it.
I was just going to say that's the next question on the discussion questions. What are the options? So a therapist, Phil, as you were saying, is an option. What other, Rob, you talked about him possibly getting his own beneficiation. Phil, you talked about that's a short-term versus long-term, right? You could get into a unit now as opposed to a tent, and then look at what you might want. That might be an improvement to that in the future. How about it might be implied in the talking about getting him benefits, but we didn't talk about physical health. So he said he was injured in the job, and that's when he started to take pain pills. So is there another option besides, is there another option besides pain pills for the treatment of whatever he's taking the pain pills for? So any physical health treatment options? And
maybe there's a board and care if it's that bad physically, but he doesn't seem like the type of guy who would want a type of like board and care facility, because that would be a lot of attention, and he seems to want to be left alone.
Yeah, and have more autonomy, right? Yeah. Or talk about as a means of gaining income. Ray was saying, is there any way we could get you to eat like mental health or physical health care? That would be okay. Like if he obviously knows benefits exist, he's helping other people get them. So what's stopping him from doing that for himself, and how can we work with that to maybe help him take care of himself first, or put himself first, and maybe then be in a better position for leadership, better position to help other people, et cetera, et cetera. And then the last question, besides the options, feel free to chime in on any of them really, but the last question is, what's the plan? And then the 2 bullets under that say, where do you start and what's the time frame? So we already talked some about plan and opportunities, but where do you start? I maybe say it again to help discuss this better.
I would think, since he has no income and you want to get him out of the elements, you start with where you can get funding and where you're going to find a landlord that will understand and rent to someone with no income. So that would be the short term, is seeing how much funding you get, how many months you could get for a room rental or something like that. And then come up with long-term goals around getting income, and then finding that apartment he really wants, which is where he's alone and not around too many people. But really, I think you got to find the money to get him in somewhere. That'd be kind of the first move. That's what we do.
Yeah. What was to make you? And some of this, like if you're getting funding, but there's still resistance, he's obviously finding some value in a situation. So if you're having resistance in just finding a landlord, and all those surfacing goals questions that Andrea went over, like what would make you more comfortable right now? So that some of these desires, answers, priority, like what has meaning to him, are coming from him, and it's not just us saying we know what's best for you. Right? So what would make you more comfortable now, and all the questions you went through, what would make your life better next week, which is what Phil's referring to, like some of the short-term steps that we could take towards those bigger dreams, whether the dream is a house with a picket fence, or in a certain area, apartment, or being surrounded. Like it seems like that, like we said, community is important for him. So what kind of housing can we find where he's gonna feel like he's part of a community, or it's quick access to people in a community? And then what's gonna make your life different in 6 months? How much money, right? How much for the lifestyle that you want, for all these goals that you want, how much money is involved in that to get the steps forward to these chainsaws are loud here, sorry. how much money is it going to take to build the life that you want, and how can we move forward to that? So anything else you saw in him that you would want to pull out of him, or impress upon him, like Andrea was saying, help people to know, excuse me, to know the skills and abilities they already have, right? Help them to see that the progress that they made, any things that you can think of that you might want to point out, or strategies to achieve that.
I think all the stuff said before is pretty good. I mean, I would build on what keeps him motivated and start at a granular level when it comes to developing the plan with him, so he understands up front the process and what his plan is, you know, making sure that his plan is the plan to get housed. So, but then being realistic with the steps that would walk him through getting into that housing, and walk him through what, you know, what the kind of the his input and his follow through would need to be with some of this stuff. So I think it's always good to be upfront with people how the process works when you want it and you want housing, but there's some commitment that needs to be made on the individual's part to getting in there the best we can. So just being upfront.
That's a really good point. What can we provide? What can you provide? And then what is going to be required from the program participant? And that just helps them to see breakout room real close in 48 seconds. Yeah. So we're just automatically going to be put back with everyone else. Would one of you be willing to volunteer to report out to the group for what we discussed? Someone's laughing.
My son's running around in the back. I'm sorry.
Oh,
so, I don't have the most stable environment to be. See, there he is. So,
all right.
I'd be happy to jump.
I would appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all for your participation. Really, really appreciate it.
No problem. All right.
Zoom is slowly reassigning our participants back into the main room, so bear with us 1 minute while Zoom completes that task.
Yeah.
All right, I think we've got everyone here now. So, Andrea, I don't know how you wanted to do the report box. You want to?
Lauren, you were going to reshare your screen. I'm reminding you.
Okay. Well, I didn't get any volunteers, so it looks like I'm doing the report back for our group.
I got a volunteer. Rob, he's raising his hand.
Let's start with Rob.
I'm trying to, wait, hold on, Rob. I'm trying to unmute you.
Rob, you should feel free to go through all the questions, or if you want to just talk about the plan, that's fine too.
Rob, if you could try to unmute yourself, it doesn't seem to be working for me.
He's unmuted.
Oh, there.
I got it.
Okay.
So with the questions in the plan, I mean, we talked really about some of the motivation and the things that he was looking for. And, you know, one of the things that he mentioned in this scenario was looking for peace and quiet. Also, you know, it was also evident that he had some ties with the community that he was helping to support there.
Yeah.
And so, you know, one of the things I suggested was looking at using that motivation for peace and quiet and kind of walking through using that as kind of the framework for looking at housing and how that could help him with obtaining that goal, his goal of to have peace and quiet. You know, there are a lot of barriers too that we saw, but could be worked through. Income was a big one. And, you know, also in addition to the pain medication as well. And so we really looked at that as using his motivation and you know, knowing and really looking at, you know, framing it out so that he understood, you know, when he was looking for housing, there would be certain commitments and certain parts that would be needed of him to follow through with the plan, so that there was some, you know, commitment on his part to working through getting to the goal, and that it wouldn't, you know, by obtaining housing wouldn't mean he wouldn't have access to the community that he's a part of and that he gets support from. And that was, you know, I think that was kind of where we had gone with this. And I don't know if I captured everything, but that was some of the stuff that we had talked about.
That's great. Yeah, it's important, and people have lives before they have housing. That's a good one. Lauren, you want to do yours?
Sure. So we had, let me show everybody who we had here. So we had Arnold, and some of the things that our group thought that Arnold was interested in because of what he was telling us and what we read about. Definitely safety, right? He had some bad experiences at the shelter. And was definitely, you know, had been hospitalized before and locked up, and was, you know, maybe a little paranoid about, you know, thinking what, again, and so he was definitely looking to be safe and to be free, right? Not to be locked up again. And to be comfortable, right? He was really interested in the concrete resources that we were offering to him: the food, the water. He was looking for better food than what was available at the shelter, clothing, and probably some companionship, because he was living in an encampment. Even though he was keeping his distance from the encampment, there was something that he was getting out of that encampment, right? Part of it was protection because the guys were looking out for him, but probably also some companionship. And so in terms of where the group thought that they might start in terms of approaching Arnold about housing and what was going to be important to him, you know, maybe, you know, certainly talking about safety, right? Like in his own place, you know, that he wouldn't have to have some of the concerns that he had at the shelter in the encampment. We thought maybe, because he really was very adamant that he was not interested in medication or seeing a doctor, and he seems like a guy that's maybe been around a long time and may have had some experiences in the system before we moved to a housing first system. And he might really think that like housing means you gotta, you know, take your medication every day and you know, and see a doctor once a month. And so making sure that he understands how things have changed and how things are different than what he maybe experienced in the past. Somebody in our group had a great idea about the money, right? Like, because he's like, his money's getting, you know, stolen by other folks in the encampment, is talking to him about the possibility of a conservator, and he may or may not be willing, if we could build enough trust with him, it might be a conversation that he was willing to have so that he could hang on to some of his money. And then in terms of the barriers, like certainly the untreated mental illness was probably going to be a barrier, right? Like both in terms of him presenting well to landlords, right? He might be a guy that landlords would be reluctant to rent to, as well as when he gets in housing, like disrupting his neighbors maybe. And so we talked about what options were available, and we talked about, you know, sort of the pros and the cons. Scattered site unit where he's not going to have to be around a lot of people. But he's also maybe not going to get the level of support that he needs, and there wouldn't be staff to kind of intervene if he was being scary towards the neighbors, versus congregate. I think different folks in our group had different ideas about what would be best for him. And then of course there's also the practical thing, like we don't know whether or not he's chronic, we don't know whether or not he's going to qualify. And so, you know, obviously in terms of where we would start, some of that just practical, like what's he eligible for, the paperwork, But then also maybe, you know, that tools preference worksheet that we talked about, understanding what his what his preferences are and how the options align to his preferences, and making sure that we are very clear with him about what the steps are, what the process is, how long each of those things are going to take, so that he doesn't feel like we're making promises we're not delivering.
That's great. Let's do Susie. So Susie's a whopper. So one of the advantages here and one of the big strengths is she did agree to go to the hotel, right? And the things that meant a lot to her are relationships and how she provides support. So her role is providing support to other people. And that was seen as really important to her. Safety was also really important to her. And there was some thinking that the guys in the encampment were providing her with some safety and how she's going to manage that. She also really likes the shower and she likes clean clothes. So she has a lot of skills, but she also has some drawbacks. And one of them is she's having trouble, you know, she's having trouble getting her needs met. And one of the things is she's a little impulsive. So that when she started bringing these guys in, the other people at the hotel who she'd been helping and liking it were rejecting her. So the beautiful thing about the hotel is we got a chance to see what it might be like in housing. So she's bringing people in. She's moving around a little bit. She's going back to the encampment. So one of the plans was to start to think about things that are really important to her. So safety. Talking to her more about her role. And we're doing this so we can predict and so we can move the role to something else. And one of the people said a long-term goal might be shared housing, where somebody that she can take care of. That one of the options in housing is to put a couple of locks on the door. So we would go through the things that meant things to her and the things that she'd been able to control. And we would talk about housing in those terms. So you really like the shower and having your own bathroom. How can we get that to you in the future where there's still things that are really important to you, like safety and having a relationship come up? What do you think the options are, right? There was some worry that she was being abused, and there was some relief that she was by herself in the hotel for some time when you could talk to her about that. And then something else came up, which is, you know, reestablishing the goals, doing the positives and negatives. What happens when people are in housing and it all goes to the wayside? So what emerged from that conversation is outreach workers are not encouraged to work with the case managers in housing because the case managers see that as solely their role. And I think that some of the things might have to change in the system because the relationship with the outreach worker is stronger than any other relationship because you actually help people for the first time. So that, you know, having them come back to the housing. So one of the things we suggested if this was happening in housing, that the first thing we have to do is make sure that she wants the housing and that the housing is important to her. And that we can help the housing provider do some of that stuff because sometimes this stuff has to be done more than once. Does that make sense? So the plan was to pursue those three things and start to identify some housing options.
Great. I'm going to move us on, I think, Andrea, because we've got about 5 minutes left. And I think some about next time in terms of that critical handoff between the outreach worker and the outreach worker's time limited, but involvement after the person is placed in housing. That's actually the topic of next week's session. So, okay. So, so shifting gears a little bit, and again, this is really only relevant for the folks that are with us today that are from PATH programs. So these are just the things that we'll be looking at in 2021, whether we come on site or we do remote or some combination, which is in this strange new world yet to be determined. But we will be doing some form of monitoring in 2021. So, and these are things that we'll look for. So So that assessment and service planning template that we looked at earlier, we said that that is required, and it's required either for all the participants that you have enrolled in your PATH program, or if you've determined in your program that you do not have enough case management capacity to do that with everyone that's enrolled, then DMIS is allowing folks to target which clients you're going to be doing that with, and that is and that you would do through your outreach plan. So there's a place in the outreach plan where you can say who you're going to target, like what your strategy is going to be for who you're going to target, and how many. Quick reminder, those plans are due to DMIS. Those updated plans are due to DMIS on August 31st, so that's coming up. And then in terms of, again, that assessment and service planning template, right? You've got to complete the initial service plan within 30 days of enrolling someone, and then it's got to be updated at least every 6 months. And we definitely heard Andrea encouraging us to do it more often than that if you can, because 6 months is a very long time. So particularly for people who are living outside. So, and then that form needs to be signed by the client to make sure that the client agrees, like, these are my goals, this is what I want, by the outreach worker and by the supervisor. And always, if a client does not want to sign, then just document that. That's fine. It's never a requirement for the client that they sign. It's a requirement that you guys attempt to get that signature. And the supervisor, that's really super important. And we want to make sure that the supervisors are reviewing the plans and providing support to the staff, who I think for some of our outreach workers, doing service planning is pretty new. It's not something everybody was doing before. And then I'll talk about the next one on this next slide. And then motivation building, right? We want to make sure that those goals and the action steps on those plans are individualized, right? They're unique to each person. We don't want to see the same goals and action steps on every plan that we pull. And we want to see, both through our conversations, because we do a lot of talking to outreach workers when we're out doing this, as well as in the case notes, that you're helping people to build motivation, right? So you're helping them to build their confidence, you're helping them to learn new skills so that they feel competent to make the change, them to explore those pros and the cons rather than telling them what to do. And because we know that you're absolutely not writing down every single thing that happens in a conversation, right? Because you really don't have, you're keeping your notes very brief. We're going to give you the benefit of the doubt, right? So unless we see something that we have concerns about, we're going to give you the benefit of the doubt. Some of the things we don't want to see are things like, I told him that was a terrible decision, or I told him, Andrea mentioned this one earlier, I told him that was an unrealistic goal and it was never going to be possible for him to do that, right? We want to build people up and build their hope. And we want to, and we certainly also wouldn't want to see something like, I told him this is his only option, right? There's always more than one option, and we want to help people to explore those options and the pros and cons. All right. So just quickly, these are the tools. I'm not going to go through this because we've gone through it on the last couple times, and we'll have an opportunity to go through it again next time when we are out of time. But I did want to say our next session, our last session, is next week. And we're going to be talking about how outreach workers can help get people ready for the transition to housing and support them through that transition. And really the absolute critical role, as Andrea was just saying, that outreach workers play in helping people through that transition and getting stabilized in housing. And then, as always, here's our contact information. If you guys have questions, concerns, comments, suggestions for how we can make next week's session or future trainings more useful for you guys, please, please, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you for your time, and we're almost close to the weekend, so enjoy your weekend. Bye, everybody.